The courtroom buzzed with muted conversations, the steady hum of whispered exchanges filling the air. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. Judge Harold Beckett, a man known for his sharp tongue and unyielding demeanor, presided over the bench with an air of arrogance. He was a man who relished his position, often pushing the limits of decorum with biting remarks aimed at those who dared to challenge him. For years, his courtroom had been a stage where he played the lead, dismissing defendants and lawyers alike with a cruel, condescending smile. But today, something was different. The case at hand wasn't particularly extraordinary on the surface. A young woman, Valerie Green, stood accused of fraud. A serious charge, but not unusual for the docket. Yet, there was something about her demeanor, a quiet strength beneath her composed exterior, that hinted at a story far more complex than the accusations suggested. Dressed in a modest navy blue suit, Valerie clutched a folder to her chest, as if it contained not just papers, but the truth she was so desperate to reveal. Judge Beckett glanced down at the case file, his expression betraying boredom. He cleared his throat and peered over his glasses at Valerie. "Miss Green, the charges against you are not trivial. Fraud, forgery, and a trail of deceit that paints a very unflattering picture. Do you have anything to say for yourself before we proceed?" Valerie opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, Beckett raised a hand. "Actually, save it. I'm sure your lawyer has prepared some grandiose defense that will waste everyone's time." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the lawyer seated beside Valerie, a figure who had remained unusually quiet until now. Alexander Reed was not just any lawyer. He was a legal powerhouse, known for his meticulous preparation and razor-sharp arguments. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, Alexander exuded confidence, his piercing eyes fixed on the judge with a calm intensity. "Your Honor," Alexander began, his voice steady but firm, "I would appreciate if you allowed my client the opportunity to address the court without prejudgment." Judge Beckett smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, I see. The big shot lawyer finally speaks. Let me guess. You're about to dazzle us with your legal jargon and theatrics." The courtroom chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh at the judge's jest or remain silent. Alexander didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a court of law, not a theater, and I would remind you that justice demands impartiality." The air grew thick with tension. For a brief moment, Judge Beckett's smug expression faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Impartiality, Mr. Reed? Don't lecture me about my job. I've been on this bench longer than you've been practicing law." Valerie's eyes darted between the judge and her lawyer, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the folder tighter. She could feel the weight of the moment, the sharp divide between her fate and the man who held it in his hands. But Alexander's calm demeanor gave her hope, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. What no one in the room knew, not the judge, not the jury, not even the spectators, was that Alexander Reed had uncovered something that would change everything. Hidden in the depths of Valerie's case file was a piece of evidence so damning, so explosive, that it threatened to unravel not just the charges against her, but the very integrity of the courtroom itself. Alexander had spent sleepless nights piecing together a puzzle that pointed to corruption, abuse of power, and a deliberate attempt to bury the truth. And at the center of it all was Judge Beckett. As the proceedings continued, Judge Beckett's taunts grew bolder, his jabs more pointed. "Tell me, Mr. Reed," he sneered, "how much is your client paying you to spin this web of fiction? Or are you doing this pro bono out of the goodness of your heart?" Alexander didn't bite. Instead, he rose from his seat with measured precision, adjusting his tie as he spoke. "Your Honor, I find it ironic that you speak of fiction, when the evidence I'm about to present will reveal a truth far stranger than any story you could imagine." The courtroom stilled. Even the court reporter paused momentarily, her fingers hovering above the keys. Judge Beckett raised an eyebrow, his smirk fading slightly. "Oh, and what truth would that be, Mr. Reed?" Alexander's gaze never wavered. "The truth, Your Honor, that this case isn't about my client's alleged fraud. It's about a system designed to suppress the innocent while protecting the guilty. And I intend to prove that my client is not the one on trial here, you are." Gasps echoed through the room. Valerie's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to Alexander, her expression a mix of fear and hope. The judge's face darkened, his usual confidence replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Mr. Reed," he snapped, his voice rising, "I will not tolerate baseless accusations in my courtroom. If you have evidence, present it. Otherwise, I suggest you tread carefully." Alexander took a deep breath, his hands steady as he reached for the folder in front of him. "I intend to, Your Honor. But I must warn you, the evidence I have will not only exonerate my client, but will also raise serious questions about your conduct on this bench." The tension in the room was palpable. Spectators leaned forward, hanging on Alexander's every word. Valerie's grip on the folder loosened as a wave of relief washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt as though someone truly believed in her innocence. Judge Beckett's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Reed. If you think you can intimidate me with theatrics, you're sorely mistaken." "This isn't intimidation, Your Honor," Alexander replied calmly. "It's accountability. Something this court has been sorely lacking." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. But before Alexander could proceed, Judge Beckett slammed his gavel, his voice booming over the noise. "Order! I will have order in my courtroom." The murmurs subsided, but the tension remained. Alexander placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of documents and photographs. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering, "what I'm about to present will not only clear my client's name, but will also expose the lengths to which certain individuals have gone to manipulate justice." Valerie held her breath, her eyes locked on Alexander. She had no idea what he was about to reveal, but she trusted him completely. The judge, however, looked visibly unsettled, his fingers drumming nervously on the bench. As Alexander lifted the first piece of evidence, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The stage was set, the players in position. But what would come next would shake the very foundation of the courtroom and Judge Beckett's career, leaving everyone on edge, waiting for the truth to emerge. Alexander held up a document, its edges slightly worn from the hours he had spent poring over it. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, "this is a signed affidavit from a whistleblower who once worked within the judicial system. Someone with first-hand knowledge of corruption and coercion tied directly to this court." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade into the background. Judge Beckett's face remained stoic, but his clenched jaw betrayed the effort it took to maintain his composure. "I'll remind you, Mr. Reed," the judge said coldly, "that making unfounded accusations can result in serious consequences. You're treading a dangerous line." "And I'll remind you, Your Honor," Alexander shot back without hesitation, "that justice demands truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be for those in power." He turned slightly, addressing the jury now. "This case, ladies and gentlemen, is about more than the charges against Ms. Green. It's about how those charges came to exist in the first place. And the evidence I'll present will show a pattern of behavior, one that calls into question not only the integrity of this prosecution, but the very foundation of this court." Valerie watched Alexander, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always believed in the justice system, even as it had turned against her. But as she listened to her lawyer's words, she began to realize how deep the cracks in that system ran. The tension in the room was unbearable as Alexander reached for another document. "This is a record of financial transactions," he said, holding it up for the court to see. "These payments, made to key individuals involved in this case, coincide suspiciously with the timeline of Ms. Green's charges. Payments that originated from an account linked to someone with direct influence over these proceedings." Judge Beckett's gavel slammed down. "Enough, Mr. Reed. This is absurd. If you think you can derail this trial with baseless insinuations." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Alexander interrupted, his voice cutting through the judge's outburst like a blade, These are not insinuations. They are facts, supported by documented evidence. And if the court is unwilling to hear them, then perhaps we should question why. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, spectators exchanging glances filled with curiosity and suspicion. The judge's face reddened, his anger barely contained. "Mr. Reed, I will not allow you to turn my courtroom into a circus." "Then let the evidence speak for itself," Alexander replied calmly, placing the financial records on the table. "And let the jury decide whether the charges against my client hold any weight." Valerie couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For months, she had been drowning in accusations, a name dragged through the mud by headlines and whispers. She had lost her job, her friends, and her peace of mind. But now, as Alexander peeled back the layers of her case, it felt as though the truth might finally come to light. Yet, the truth wasn't without its cost. As Alexander continued, he painted a vivid picture of a justice system tainted by greed and power. He described how evidence had been manipulated, witnesses coerced, and narratives twisted to fit a convenient storyline. Each revelation felt like a punch to the gut, not just for Valerie but for everyone in the room. The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. But the most surprising reaction came from Judge Beckett himself. Though he tried to maintain his composure, subtle cracks began to show. His hands fidgeted, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He interrupted Alexander more frequently, his objections becoming increasingly frantic. It was clear that the judge, who had always prided himself on being the master of his courtroom, was losing control. Alexander seized on this, his confidence growing with each passing moment. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge directly, "if you have nothing to hide, then why not allow this evidence to be examined? Why not let the truth come out?" Beckett's voice was sharp, almost trembling. "You're walking a fine line, Mr. Reed. I suggest you tread carefully." But Alexander didn't back down. "The only line I'm walking, Your Honor, is the one that leads to justice. And if that line happens to cross paths with those who abuse their power, so be it." Valerie's mind raced as she listened, piecing together the fragments of her ordeal. The charges against her had come out of nowhere, blindsiding her just as her career was taking off. She had been accused of falsifying documents to secure a major contract for her small business, a claim she knew was false. But no matter how much she protested her innocence, the evidence seemed stacked against her, evidence she now realized had been fabricated. The trial wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing a system that had failed countless others before her. And as Alexander continued to unravel the web of deceit, it became clear that the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation, the weight of Alexander's words sinking in. But just as he prepared to present the next piece of evidence, the unexpected happened. A figure stood up from the back of the room, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit, his face pale and drawn. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky but determined. "Your Honor, if I may." All eyes turned to him, the room holding its collective breath. Even Alexander seemed momentarily caught off guard. Judge Beckett's face darkened. "Who are you, and why are you interrupting these proceedings?" The man hesitated, glancing nervously at Alexander before meeting the judge's glare. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I was once an aide in this courtroom." The name sparked a flurry of whispers among the spectators. Thomas Reed had been a quiet, unassuming figure during his time as an aide, often fading into the background. But now, as he stood before the court, there was an urgency in his demeanor that couldn't be ignored. "I have information," Thomas continued, his gaze flickering between the judge and Alexander. "Information that supports Mr. Reed's claims." Judge Beckett's gavel slammed down, a sound echoing through the room. "This is highly irregular. Sit down, Mr. Reed, or I'll have you removed." But Thomas didn't budge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice growing steadier, "I stayed silent for years because I was afraid. But I can't stay silent anymore. People's lives are being ruined, and I can't be a part of it." The tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Valerie's breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. She didn't know who Thomas Reed was or what he might reveal, but his words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Alexander turned to Thomas, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Mr. Reed," he said, "if you have information that can shed light on this case, we would be grateful to hear it." Judge Beckett's voice cut through the tension like a jagged blade. "Mr. Reed, you've made your point. If you have no further evidence, I suggest we move on and allow the jury to decide based on the facts of this case." But Alexander wasn't finished. "Your Honor," he said, his tone sharper now, "the facts of this case are directly tied to the integrity of this courtroom. And there's more, much more, that the jury and the public deserve to know." With a click, Alexander brought up another document. This one was an email exchange between Judge Beckett and a prominent local businessman, one of the individuals linked to the suspicious transactions. The messages were blunt, discussing favors, payments, and even specific outcomes for trials. Gasps echoed through the room as the jury leaned forward, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. "Your Honor," Alexander continued, his gaze locking onto the judge, "can you explain why your email address appears in this correspondence, discussing favorable rulings in exchange for financial compensation?" Beckett's face darkened, his knuckles gripping the edge of his bench. "This is an outrageous invasion of privacy. Those emails are irrelevant and inadmissible." Alexander didn't flinch. "On the contrary, Your Honor, they are entirely relevant. They show a pattern of corruption that directly impacts my client's case and countless others. This is about accountability." The murmurs in the room grew louder, the weight of the revelations pressing down on everyone present. Valerie's heart pounded as she glanced at the jury. Their faces told a story of their own: shock, anger, and a growing resolve to uncover the truth. For the first time, it felt like the tide might truly be turning in her favor. But the victory was far from secure. Beckett leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "Mr. Reed, you're playing a dangerous game. Be very careful about the accusations you make without solid proof." Alexander smiled faintly, a glint of determination in his eyes. "The proof is right here, Your Honor. And it's not going away." As the tension escalated, a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A man in a crisp suit and tie strode in, flanked by two others who appeared equally serious. The room fell silent as the trio approached the bench, their presence commanding attention. "Your Honor," the lead man said, his voice firm, "I'm Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have been conducting a parallel investigation into allegations of corruption within this court. Based on the evidence presented here today, we have reason to believe that you, Judge Beckett, are directly involved." The judge's face went pale, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. These accusations are baseless." Agent Miller remained calm, his gaze steady. "We have a warrant to seize all records pertaining to this case and others you've presided over. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties pending further investigation." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered furiously, their shock and disbelief palpable. Valerie sat frozen, her mind racing as she tried to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Judge Beckett, the man who had wielded so much power over her fate, was now facing the consequences of his actions. But even as the FBI agents began collecting evidence, Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Beckett was cornered, yes, but men like him didn't go down without a fight. She glanced at Alexander, who gave her a reassuring nod. He had fought tirelessly for her, but she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger struggle. Beckett stood, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you can destroy me with a few baseless allegations? This is my courtroom, my legacy. You'll regret this, every one of you." Agent Miller stepped forward, his expression unyielding. "Judge Beckett, you have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it." As the judge was escorted out, his shouts echoing down the hallway, Valerie felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The man who had tried to ruin her life was being held accountable, but the scars of the ordeal ran deep. She glanced at Thomas, who sat quietly, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his confession had finally caught up to him. Alexander turned to Valerie, his voice soft but firm. "This is a step forward, but it's not the end. There's still work to do." Valerie nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come too far to give up now. The truth was out, but the fight for justice was far from over. As the courtroom emptied, the sense of anticipation hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew the climax was near, but no one could predict how it would unfold. Judge Beckett's voice was icy. "This is my courtroom, and I decide what's relevant. Bailiff, escort this man out." But before the bailiff could move, Thomas stepped forward, his voice rising above the commotion. "I have proof," he said, his eyes locking onto the judge. "Proof that you've been tampering with cases, silencing witnesses, and manipulating outcomes for years." The room erupted into chaos, the weight of Thomas' accusation hanging heavily in the air. Judge Beckett's face turned a deep shade of red, his fury barely contained. But beneath the anger was something else, a flicker of fear that sent a ripple through the room. Valerie's heart raced as she realized that the battle for her freedom had become something far bigger. The truth was finally emerging, but it was only the beginning. What lay ahead would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever placed their trust in the justice system. The courtroom was a powder keg, and Thomas Reed's revelation had been the spark. People whispered furiously among themselves, their words blending into a chaotic hum of shock and curiosity. Valerie sat frozen, her pulse pounding as she tried to process what she had just heard. Could it be true? Could the judge presiding over her trial, the very man who held her future in his hands, be involved in something so corrupt? Judge Beckett leaned forward, gripping the edge of his bench as his voice thundered over the noise. "Enough. This is a court of law, not a forum for baseless accusations. Mr. Reed, you've crossed a line, and I will not tolerate this kind of disruption." Thomas didn't flinch. His face was pale, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "Your Honor, I know what I'm saying will cost me, but I've carried this secret for too long, and I can't keep quiet anymore. People deserve the truth." Alexander stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, it's clear Mr. Reed has vital information related to this case. I request that he be allowed to speak. This is about justice, not convenience." Beckett's eyes narrowed, his composure cracking under the strain. "Mr. Reed, I will not allow you to turn this trial into a circus. Mr. Reed's claims are irrelevant, and this court will not entertain unfounded allegations." But the murmurs from the jury and spectators told a different story. The cracks in the judge's authority were becoming impossible to ignore. Even the bailiff hesitated, unsure whether to follow Beckett's order to remove Thomas. Thomas took a deep breath, then turned to the jury, his voice trembling but resolute. "I worked in this courtroom for years. I've seen things no one should ever see. Documents destroyed, witnesses silenced, decisions influenced by money instead of evidence. And Judge Beckett, he's at the center of it all." Gasps rippled through the room. Valerie's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. Every word Thomas spoke felt like a lifeline, a thread of hope pulling her closer to freedom. But it also carried a chilling weight. If the judge was corrupt, how deep did it go? How many lives had been destroyed in his pursuit of power? Alexander seized the moment, his voice firm but measured. "Your Honor, these are serious allegations that demand investigation. If this court is truly impartial, then Mr. Reed's testimony must be heard." Beckett slammed his gavel, his face a mask of fury. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Reed. I decide what's relevant, and I will not allow this trial to be derailed by conspiracy theories." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked its usual authority. His protests felt hollow, the desperation seeping through. It was clear to everyone in the room that something wasn't right. The tension only deepened as Alexander turned his attention back to Thomas. "Mr. Reed, you mentioned proof. Do you have evidence to support your claims?" Thomas nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "It's all here," he said, holding it up. emails, bank transfers, records that were supposed to be destroyed. I saved everything because I knew one day the truth would matter. The room seemed to hold its breath as Alexander stepped forward and took the drive from Thomas. Valerie watched as her lawyer examined it, his expression a mix of relief and determination. This wasn't just a turning point in her case. It was a seismic shift in everything she thought she knew about the justice system. Judge Beckett's voice cracked as he tried to regain control. This is outrageous. Mr. Reed, you're nothing but a disgruntled former employee trying to settle a score. Bailiff, remove him from this courtroom immediately. The bailiff hesitated, glancing at Alexander, then at the murmuring jury. The room was no longer under the judge's control. The power he once wielded so confidently was slipping through his fingers. Alexander turned back to the judge, his voice calm but unyielding. Your Honor, if you truly believe Mr. Reed's claims are baseless, then you have nothing to fear. Let the evidence be reviewed, let the truth come out. Beckett's face turned crimson, his knuckles white, as he gripped the bench. For a moment, it looked as though he might explode, but then his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. He knew the courtroom was no longer his to command. Fine, he snapped, his voice brittle. If you want to waste this court's time tracing wild accusations, so be it. But I warn you, Mr. Reed, this will not end well for you or your client. Alexander didn't flinch. The truth rarely ends well for those who try to hide it. Valerie exhaled shakily, her heart pounding as she watched the drama unfold. The USB drive was now the focal point of the trial, a ticking time bomb that could either vindicate her or expose an even deeper conspiracy. But as the court prepared to examine its contents, a new wave of anxiety washed over her. If the judge truly was corrupt, what lengths would he go to in order to protect himself? Meanwhile, the spectators whispered furiously, their curiosity and unease growing with each passing moment. For years, Judge Beckett had been a pillar of authority, a man whose decisions were rarely questioned. But now, as the cracks in his facade became more apparent, the seeds of doubt took root. How many other cases had he presided over? How many other lives had been affected by his decisions? As Alexander prepared to present the evidence, Valerie glanced at Thomas. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. She could see the fear etched into his features, the weight of what he had done pressing heavily on him. He had taken a risk, a monumental one, and she couldn't help but wonder what it had cost him. The suspense in the courtroom was unbearable. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath as Alexander plugged the USB drive into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, and the first document appeared. A detailed record of financial transactions that left no doubt about their implications. The evidence was damning, but it was only the beginning. As Alexander scrolled through the files, the story they told became clearer. A web of corruption that stretched far beyond Valerie's case, implicating not just the judge but others within the system. It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through the room, leaving everyone questioning how such a betrayal of trust could have gone unnoticed for so long. But even as the truth began to surface, Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from the end. The fight had only just begun, and the forces arrayed against them would not go down without a fight. The courtroom was charged with an almost unbearable tension. The faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of papers were the only sounds as Alexander projected the first document onto the screen for all to see. Every eye in the room followed the trail of evidence he laid out, transactions, dates, and names that painted a damning picture. Judge Beckett shifted uneasily in his seat, his once commanding presence diminished under the weight of undeniable proof. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Alexander said, his voice steady but intense, this isn't just about Ms. Green. This is about a system that has been manipulated to serve the interests of the powerful at the expense of the innocent. These financial transactions are just the tip of the iceberg. Valerie felt a wave of emotions crash over her as she watched Alexander expertly dismantle the case against her. For months, she had been portrayed as a criminal, a reputation smeared beyond recognition. Now the truth was emerging, but it wasn't without a cost. She could see the fear in Thomas Reed's eyes as he sat near the witness stand, his hands trembling slightly. He had risked everything to come forward, and Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The courtroom felt eerily silent after Judge Beckett's dramatic removal, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Valerie remained seated, staring at the now vacant bench, her mind swirling with everything that had just unfolded. The walls that had seemed to close in on her just hours ago now felt slightly further away, but the weight of the trial wasn't gone. If anything, it had shifted, growing heavier with the uncertainty of what would happen next. Alexander packed up his files quietly, his expression unreadable. Valerie leaned closer, her voice low and filled with unease. "Do you think this will be enough? The evidence, the FBI. Do you think I'll finally be free?" Alexander paused, looking at her with the same calm determination that had carried her through this nightmare. "It's a step in the right direction, Valerie, but the fight isn't over yet. The system is vast, and the people who benefit from its corruption won't go down easily." Beckett wasn't acting alone. His words settled over her like a shadow, heavy and foreboding. She wanted to believe that Beckett's removal would mean an end to her ordeal, but deep down, she knew the truth. Powerful men like him rarely worked in isolation. For someone like Beckett to operate so brazenly for so long, there had to be others, people who had just as much to lose if their secrets came to light. The murmurs of the remaining spectators pulled her out of her thoughts. Valerie looked around the courtroom, noticing a group of people clustered near the back, speaking in hushed tones. Among them was a woman in a sharp navy suit, her piercing eyes scanning the room as though she were piecing together a puzzle. Valerie didn't recognize her, but something about the way the woman carried herself made her uneasy. As Valerie prepared to leave, the woman approached, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. "Miss Green," she said, her voice smooth but cold, "I'm Linda Carver, attorney representing certain interests tied to this case. May I have a word?" Alexander stepped forward immediately, his body language protective. "Anything you have to say to my client, you can say to me." Linda's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Of course, I simply wanted to extend an offer, one that might save everyone here a great deal of trouble." She turned her attention to Valerie, her tone softening just slightly. "You've been through a lot, Miss Green, more than anyone should have to endure. But the road ahead isn't as clear-cut as you might think. There are forces at play here that neither you nor your lawyer fully understand. If you're willing to drop this case and walk away quietly, I'm authorized to ensure your freedom and safety." Valerie felt a chill crawl up her spine. The offer was as tempting as it was terrifying. "Walk away," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything that's happened, after what they've done to me?" Linda's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened like a predator sizing up its prey. "Sometimes justice isn't about winning a battle, Ms. Green. Sometimes it's about knowing which battles are worth fighting. Think about it, your name cleared, your life back. No more trials, no more threats. All you have to do is step away." Alexander's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "And what happens to the truth, Miss Carver? What happens to the people who've been hurt by this corruption? Do they just get swept under the rug with your client's secrets?" Linda's smile didn't falter, but there was an edge to her tone now. "The truth, Mr. Reed, is rarely as black and white as you make it out to be. Sometimes the cost of uncovering it is too high for everyone involved." Valerie's chest tightened as she looked between the two of them. The temptation of freedom tugged at her, but so did the weight of responsibility. She had seen firsthand the destruction wrought by the corruption in Beckett's courtroom. If she walked away now, it would stand up for the others who had suffered in silence. Before she could respond, the door to the courtroom swung open, and Thomas Reed re-entered, his face pale and his movements hurried. He glanced around nervously before making his way to Alexander and Valerie. "They know," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "Whoever's behind this, they know what I've done. I've been getting messages, threats. They're not going to let this go." Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered by the revelation. It seems your star witness has realized the dangers of poking a sleeping bear. Thomas glared at her, his fear momentarily replaced by anger. I didn't come forward for myself. The tension in the room was palpable. I did it because people like the stakes rising with every passing ruining second. Lives for years. Valerie felt her resolve harden as she watched Thomas stand his ground despite his fear. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. Linda seemed to sense the shift in Valerie's demeanor. She sighed softly, as though disappointed, and straightened her jacket. Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you. This fight will cost you more than you realize. With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving an uneasy silence in her wake. Valerie turned to Alexander, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. We can't stop now. Whatever it takes, we have to see this through. Alexander nodded, his expression resolute. Then we fight. But we need to be ready for everything. As they prepared for the next steps, the sense of looming danger grew heavier. The courtroom had been a battleground, but it was clear a real fight was just beginning. The trial resumed 2 days later, but the energy in the courtroom was entirely different. The removal of Judge Beckett had sent ripples through the legal system, but his absence didn't mean the end of Valerie's fight. A new judge, one known for integrity, now presided over the case, but the stakes had only grown higher. Valerie and Alexander knew that the network protecting Beckett would not go down without a final, desperate attempt to shield themselves. As Alexander began his closing arguments, the weight of the evidence they had gathered became clear. He carefully laid out the financial connections, the corrupt decisions, and the testimony of Thomas Reed, painting a picture of a system designed to exploit and destroy those who couldn't defend themselves. Valerie watched the jury closely, seeing their anger and disbelief grow with each revelation. It gave her hope, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, just as Alexander was about to conclude, the doors to the courtroom burst open. Everyone turned to see Linda Carver stride in, flanked by a man Valerie didn't recognize. He was tall, with an air of authority and an unsettling smirk that made her stomach twist. The man approached the bench, carrying a thick folder, and handed it to the judge without a word. I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor, Linda said smoothly, her voice carrying a note of triumph. But this evidence just came to light, and it directly impacts the integrity of these proceedings. Alexander's jaw tightened as he watched the judge flip through the folder's contents. Whatever was in there, it was clear Linda intended to use it as her final weapon. The judge looked up, his expression unreadable, and addressed Alexander. Mr. Reed, this document alleges significant misconduct on your part, including tampering with evidence and coercing a witness. If these claims are substantiated, it would invalidate much of your case. Gasps filled the room, and Valerie felt her heart drop. She turned to Alexander, who stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to derail justice. These allegations are not only false, but deliberately timed to sabotage my client's defense. Linda smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming with confidence. The truth is never convenient, Mr. Reed. As the tension in the room mounted, Valerie felt a wave of despair. It was a calculated move, one designed to make them doubt everything. But then she noticed something, a subtle shift in Alexander's posture. He wasn't defeated, he was preparing for something. Your Honor, Alexander said, his voice steady, I anticipated this tactic. If I may, I'd like to present evidence to refute these claims. The judge nodded, and Alexander approached the bench with a USB drive. This contains communications between Miss Carver and several individuals tied to this case. It will show that these allegations were fabricated in an effort to obstruct justice. The room fell silent as the files were projected onto the screen. Emails and messages between Linda and her associates revealed a carefully orchestrated plan to discredit Alexander and silence Thomas Reed. Each piece of evidence was a blow to their credibility, and Linda's confidence began to waver. But the final blow came when Alexander pulled out a recording device. Your Honor, this is a conversation between Miss Carver and a private investigator, recorded legally and provided anonymously. It confirms their intent to manipulate this trial. He played the recording, and the courtroom was filled with Linda's voice, clear and unmistakable, outlining her strategy to protect the network behind Beckett. The jury listened intently, their expressions shifting from shock to outrage. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Linda's smirk vanished, replaced by a pale, stunned expression. The man who had accompanied her looked equally shaken, his bravado crumbling under the scrutiny of the courtroom. Valerie felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't over yet. The judge leaned forward, his tone firm. "Miss Carver, based on this evidence, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into your conduct and the individuals implicated in these communications. This trial will proceed fairly, without further interference." As Linda was escorted out, her composure shattered, Valerie felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Alexander finished his closing arguments with the full force of their truth behind him, and the jury's decision was unanimous. Valerie was exonerated, her name cleared, and the corruption that had nearly destroyed her life was exposed for all to see. But just as she stepped out of the courtroom, breathing in the crisp air of freedom, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. The message was simple, but its implications were chilling. "Asterisk, you won this round, but it's not over. Watch your back." Asterisk. Valerie looked at Alexander, her resolve hardening once more. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. As she walked away, she knew she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who couldn't. And no matter what came next, she wouldn't back down.